Hi, my name's Cheese, and welcome to another Fossil Sweeper Progress Update video. If you haven't heard of the project before, you can find an overview here, but the TLDR is, it's like Minesweeper but you're digging up fossils, and you get to build skeletons out of the stuff you find. For the past month or so, I've been working on placement mechanics for the museum phase. I've implemented some new sound effects, and I've also been working with Peter on a new music track. Avatars now emit footstep sounds. In order to keep this timed to animations and to avoid needing to author stuff in Godot, I'm keeping the timings defined elsewhere and applying those to animations in a method track at runtime. Since the walk animation can play at variable speed with analog input, tying it to the animation means it will always be in sync, and being done by a function means that I can play the step sound louder or quieter depending upon how fast the player is moving. I'm open to the idea of separating left and right footsteps and giving those stereo offset, but that's something low priority that I can revisit later if I have time. This is using the first pass footstep sounds that Jasmine put together a while back, so I've had a nice big bank of samples to work with. These have reverb baked in, which isn't quite working in all contexts, and there are some surfaces that aren't currently represented. So we're looking at redoing them and doing reverb at runtime, which we can better tune to different museum room sizes and so forth. Peter and I have also been working on a song for the game's credit sequence. It's not a Beatles tribute by any stretch, but this is a song in the same way that Being Together from Hive Time's soundtrack was. Peter's soundtrack for my previous game of scale, Hive Time, is very good. You can find it on Bandcamp, link in the description. This time I've been able to write lyrics and contribute some chords that Peter has been able to iterate on and push into a much more upbeat space than my melancholy strumming. In order to make footstep sound stuff work nicely in the dig phase, I added a sound surface property to each biome's ground definitions that let me indicate which step sounds should be played. The mapping of sounds to locations is a bit rough at the moment, but having some differentiation is really nice. I'm expecting to need to do a bit more work on it, but for this first pass I had to refactor some of how the dig phase's camera processing works to make it easier to move an audio listener around the scene affected by the camera's position and orientation, but still staying close enough to the ground to hear distant footsteps when zoomed all the way out. Peter's put together a new music track for the assembly phase, which plays when puzzle mode is active. This is a lower energy variant of the normal assembly track, which we both agreed was a little too hectic for the puzzle mode's more relaxed gameplay. I had to make a couple of changes to the music manager in order to get this to work the way I wanted, but it built on work that I'd done for the biome-specific music for the dig phase and was pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, it uses explicit track names, which undermines the plans I had for players being able to use custom music by just dropping arbitrary OGG files in a folder. That's not a super important part of the game though, and I can always come back and implement some alternative functionality specific for custom music later if I want. Most of this month's attention went into the museum phase. I separated specimen organizing into a separate editing state, which is accessed by clicking on a mount. This limits the interaction to the mount specimens, and while it's an extra click, it makes things feel a bit more organized and deliberate. It makes it harder to accidentally interact with something on the other side of the room. Once this was done, I started work on adding support for selecting multiple items, initially starting with shift-clicking to add to the current selection. I'd planned on doing this eventually, so past me made this fairly painless. All I needed to do was write some functions that iterated through a list containing the selected items and replace my existing item manipulation with those function calls. Once that was behaving, I added click and drag box selection, which is calculated by defining a collision volume that fills the area of the camera frustum covered by a 2D rectangle on the near clipping plane. I had a few fun gotchas along the way, and had to do some optimizing so that I wasn't getting multiple contacts per item, but it's running well enough for now, and it's fun to use. I haven't implemented this for keyboard or gamepad controls yet, since I need to do some work on an alternate camera mode for editing before that will make sense. Along the way, I also fixed some long-standing placement bugs, and added the option to cancel move and rotate operations before placing selected items. A very big thank you to the supporters going by on screen at the moment. The supporters help me eat while making this game, and I am so very appreciative. A huge thanks also to Screen Tasmania, who supported this project with a small grant. Anyway, that's about it for today. If you'd like to keep track of development or try the playable prototype, there are links in the description. And if you're super keen to check out what we talked about here today, I make early test builds available to my supporters on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye!